The memo arrived on Captain Walter Donnelly's desk on a Thursday morning in early November, tucked between a budget requisition and a notice about the department's upcoming holiday scheduling freeze, and it sat there for 3 hours before Donnelly worked up the particular kind of resigned courage required to open it. He already knew what it contained, in the same way that everyone in the department's upper tier always knew, in advance, what any document concerning Harry Callahan was going to contain: another incident, another use of force review, another formal complaint from someone whose attorney had decided that Harry's methods represented a more actionable grievance than whatever crime Harry had been in the process of preventing when the methods became visible. The memo was from Internal Affairs. It ran to 11 pages. Donnelly read it once, front to back, set it down, and stared at his office window for a long moment before reaching for the phone. Then he put the phone back without dialing, because the conversation he needed to have couldn't happen over the phone, and because there was a part of him, a part he would never have admitted to in any official capacity, that wasn't entirely sure he wanted to have it at all. Because the thing about Harry Callahan that Internal Affairs never quite managed to capture in 11 pages, or in the 47 pages of the prior year's review, or in the combined several hundred pages of documentation that had accumulated over 2 decades of exactly this same pattern repeating itself, was the thing that made Donnelly's job both easier and considerably more complicated than anyone outside the department could fully appreciate: Harry Callahan was right. Not procedurally right. Not right in any way that a review board could endorse or a use of force analyst could sanction or a city attorney could defend in open court. But right in the deeper and more inconvenient sense that the outcomes Harry produced, the cases closed, the threats neutralized, the bodies that didn't accumulate on city streets because someone had intervened before the accumulation could begin. Those outcomes were real, and they were happening, and without Harry Callahan producing them, a version of San Francisco existed that nobody in the department's upper tier wanted to have to manage. This is the fear that nobody named in any official document. The fear of Harry Callahan inside the San Francisco Police Department was not, at its core, the fear of a rogue officer whose methods might expose the city to liability, though that fear was real and documented extensively. It was not the fear of a man who might one day go genuinely too far in a way that crossed from defensible excess into something irrecoverable, though that fear existed too, a quiet undertone in every after-action review, every internal affairs interview, every conversation between senior officers about how long the arrangement could continue before something broke in a way that couldn't be managed. The deepest fear, the one that lived in the silences of those conversations and in the careful language of the memos and in the particular way that captains like Donnelly held their phones without dialing for a long moment before setting them down, that fear was simpler and more disturbing than either of the others. It was the fear that Harry Callahan was the only thing standing between the city and something considerably worse, and that the department had no idea what to do with that knowledge, and no plan for what happened if they ever actually succeeded in constraining him enough to make him stop. Captain Donnelly had been with the department for 26 years when the November memo arrived, long enough to have watched Harry Callahan come up through the ranks and to have developed, over that time, a relationship with him that defied every standard category the department offered for classifying the connection between a supervisor and a subordinate. It wasn't friendship, exactly, though there was genuine respect in it, the kind that accumulates between two people who have watched each other operate under pressure long enough to have a complete and honest understanding of what the other person is actually made of. It wasn't the standard supervisory relationship either, because the standard supervisory relationship assumed a basic alignment between the supervisor's institutional priorities and the subordinate's operational methods, and Harry's methods had never aligned with anyone's institutional priorities in any direct or comfortable sense. What it was, Donnelly had eventually concluded, was something closer to a necessary tension. The kind that exists between a city's need for someone willing to do the things the institution cannot officially sanction and the institution's need to maintain the fiction that all its operations fall within sanctioned parameters. Harry provided the former. Donnelly managed the latter. And between the two of them, over 26 years, they had developed an intricate and largely unspoken understanding of exactly how far each could push before the arrangement became genuinely untenable. The November memo suggested that someone, somewhere in the city's legal apparatus, had decided the arrangement had become genuinely untenable. Donnelly picked up the phone again. This time he dialed. Harry arrived at Donnelly's office 20 minutes later, which meant he'd been in the building when the call came through, which meant he had already known the memo existed and had been waiting for the conversation with the patience of a man who had sat through enough of these conversations to have stopped finding them either surprising or particularly threatening. He sat down across from Donnelly's desk with his coat still on and his hands resting loosely on his thighs, and Donnelly noticed, not for the first time, that Harry's stillness in these moments was a different quality of stillness than the stillness of a man who was simply calm. It was the stillness of a man who had already processed every possible version of the conversation that was about to happen and had arrived at the meeting having already decided, quietly and completely, which version he was willing to participate in and which he wasn't. 11 pages, Donnelly said, sliding the memo across the desk without opening it. Harry glanced at it without touching it. Feels about right, he said. Donnelly leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something he did when he was trying to find a way to say something that resisted the kind of clean formulation that official conversations were supposed to operate in. Harry, he said finally, still looking at the ceiling, there are people in this building who genuinely believe that you are the most dangerous thing in San Francisco right now. Not the most dangerous thing the department has to deal with. The most dangerous thing in the city. Full stop. The silence that followed this statement contained several things simultaneously: Harry's complete lack of surprise at hearing it, Donnelly's own discomfort with having said it out loud, and the particular quality of shared understanding that existed between two people who both knew that the statement was simultaneously an exaggeration and, in certain important respects, exactly accurate. The internal affairs file on Harry Callahan, the complete one, the one that went back to the beginning of his career and forward through every incident review and use of force analysis and formal complaint that had been filed against him in 2 decades, ran to nearly 400 pages by the time of the November memo. Donnelly had read all of it, multiple times, because understanding the full scope of it was part of what his job required when managing someone whose operational footprint was this unusual. What the file revealed, read from beginning to end, was not the portrait of a corrupt or reckless officer, 2 categories the department had extensive experience identifying and processing. What it revealed was something considerably more difficult to categorize. A man of genuine and consistent principle operating through methods that the institution could not sanction but also, in practice, could not afford to fully suppress. The principles were evident across every incident. Harry never manufactured evidence. He never planted weapons on suspects. He never falsified reports or intimidated witnesses into cooperation through threats of harm. The things he did that generated internal affairs reviews were all, in their various ways, variations on a single theme. He applied force, sometimes considerably more force than official guidelines recommended, in situations where he had concluded, correctly, that the threat level required it and that the time available for procedurally orthodox responses had either run out or had never existed. He was always right about the threat level. He was sometimes wrong, or at least officially questionable, about the precise quantum of force the threat required. And this tension, between his accurate threat assessment and his sometimes excessive response, was what filled 400 pages of file over 20 years and what made him simultaneously the department's most valuable asset and its most persistent institutional headache. The specific incident that had generated the November memo was, by Harry's standards, relatively unremarkable. A suspected serial arsonist named Franklin Cross had been identified through investigative work that Harry had done largely on his own time, following a pattern of fires in the Sunset District that the official investigation had been slow to connect despite evidence that Harry considered obvious from the third fire onward. Cross had a prior record, a history of escalating behavior, and what Harry had determined, through a combination of surveillance and source work that technically exceeded the boundaries of his assigned case, was that Cross was preparing for what would have been his largest and most catastrophic fire yet. A warehouse in the industrial waterfront area that was being used, without anyone's official knowledge, as temporary housing by a shifting population of somewhere between 40 and 70 people who had nowhere else to go. The official investigation had not yet established probable cause for a warrant. The timeline, as Harry had calculated it, did not leave room for the official investigation to establish probable cause before Cross acted. Harry had made the calculation, alone and without authorization, that the 40 to 70 people in the warehouse outweighed the procedural requirements he was being asked to observe, and he had acted accordingly, confronting Cross in a parking garage 2 blocks from the warehouse with a directness that the 11-page memo described, in the careful language of people who deal in understatement, as significantly outside established use of force protocols. Cross had been hospitalized with a broken wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion. The warehouse had not burned. Nobody in it had died. And Harry had filed a report so stripped of operational detail that the internal affairs investigators who reviewed it spent the better part of a week trying to reconstruct the actual sequence of events from surveillance footage, witness statements, and the specific geometry of Cross's injuries. What the November memo did not contain, and what Donnelly understood to be its most significant omission, was any accounting of the 40 to 70 people in the warehouse. It mentioned them, briefly, in a single paragraph near the end, as the stated justification for Harry's decision to act outside authorized parameters. But it treated them as a counterweight in a procedural analysis, not as a human reality. As an abstraction to be balanced against the department's liability exposure and the constitutional concerns raised by Harry's methods, rather than as specific human beings who had been sleeping in a warehouse that would have burned around them if Harry had waited for the proper paperwork. This omission was not accidental. The memo had been written by people whose job was to assess procedural compliance, not outcomes, and who had learned, over careers spent in internal affairs, that allowing outcome thinking to contaminate procedural analysis produced exactly the kind of impossible moral arithmetic that led senior officers to sit in their offices staring at windows and not dialing phones. If you let yourself think about the 40 to 70 people, if you actually sat with the specific human weight of that number, the entire procedural apparatus of the memo became extremely difficult to take seriously. So the memo didn't make you think about the 40 to 70 people. It made you think about cross-legal liability and departmental exposure and the civil rights implications of a detective who had substituted his own judgment for the warrant process. These were all real concerns. They were also, when set against the warehouse, the kind of concerns that required a very particular kind of institutional narrowness of vision to maintain. Harry understood this narrowness better than anyone. He had watched it operate for 20 years, had watched it produce exactly the kinds of outcomes it was designed to prevent. Had watched it free killers and stall investigations and create precisely the institutional paralysis that, in his view, made men like Harry Callahan not just useful but necessary. And yet he also understood, in a way that the people who built the narrowness rarely understood about themselves, that the narrowness existed for reasons that weren't entirely without merit. The warrant requirement, the use of force protocols, the procedural safeguards that Harry routinely bent and occasionally broke, these weren't arbitrary bureaucratic obstacles invented to frustrate good police work. They existed because the history of law enforcement, in San Francisco and everywhere else, was full of examples of what happened when individual officers substituted their own judgment for external constraints, and most of those examples did not end with 40 to 70 people being saved from a warehouse fire. Most of them ended with something considerably darker, with power being applied against people who couldn't defend themselves, with the machinery of violence that a society authorizes its police to use being turned toward purposes that no democratic institution could or should endorse. Harry knew this history. He had thought about it seriously, more seriously than his critics tended to assume, and what he had concluded, the conclusion that organized everything about how he operated, was that the history was real and the safeguards were real and the safeguards still needed to be, sometimes, overridden, because the alternative was watching a preventable catastrophe develop in real time while waiting for a process that moved at its own speed regardless of the speed of the threat. This was not a comfortable conclusion. It was not one Harry celebrated or wore as a badge. It was simply what 2 decades of watching San Francisco be San Francisco had taught him, and he carried it with the same flat, undemonstrative certainty he brought to everything else. Donnelly asked Harry, that morning in the office with the 11-page memo sitting untouched on the desk between them, whether he understood what was at stake in the current climate. Harry said he understood. Donnelly asked whether Harry understood that the department's ability to protect him from the consequences of his methods was not unlimited, that there were people above Donnelly in the chain who were running out of patience and running out of legal cover, and that the next incident, depending on its visibility and the political appetite of whoever was in the city attorney's office at the time, could go differently than every prior incident had gone. Harry said he understood that too. Donnelly looked at him for a long moment, trying to find, in the flat and completely unreadable face across the desk, some evidence of the calculation that must have been happening behind it, some visible sign of a man weighing the institutional warning he'd just received against whatever internal accounting he maintained for these conversations. He found nothing. Harry's face offered no more information in that moment than it offered in any other moment, which was precisely the amount of information Harry intended to share and nothing additional. "Are you going to stop?" Donnelly asked finally, the question direct in a way that their conversations rarely were, stripped of the careful diplomatic framing that usually governed discussions between them. Harry's answer was equally direct, equally stripped of framing, the kind of answer that contains exactly what it says and nothing else. "No," Harry said. And Donnelly had known, before he asked, what the answer was going to be, and he nodded once, picked up the memo, and placed it in a drawer, and neither of them said anything further about it for the rest of the meeting. The department's fear of Harry Callahan operated on 3 distinct levels, and understanding all 3 is necessary for understanding why someone like Donnelly, a man of genuine institutional loyalty and genuine personal integrity, continued to manage that fear rather than resolving it in the obvious direction. The first level was the liability fear, the one the memos documented. Every incident involving Harry created legal exposure for the city, and the accumulation of those incidents over 2 decades had produced a specific vulnerability that the city attorney's office monitored with the anxious attention of someone watching a very old building for structural cracks. This fear was manageable, had been managed, would continue to be managed as long as Harry's outcomes remained defensible and his methods remained in the gray area between excessive and catastrophic. The second level was more personal, the fear of what Harry represented about the department itself. His existence, and the department's tolerance of his existence, was an implicit admission that the official machinery was insufficient. That there were problems in San Francisco that the department's authorized methods could not solve, and that, rather than fix the official machinery, the city had chosen to maintain a single exceptional operator who existed outside the rules as a kind of permanent workaround. This admission, if made explicit, would be deeply uncomfortable for everyone who had built their careers on the integrity and sufficiency of the official machinery. So it was never made explicit. Harry was managed instead. Criticized in memos, protected in practice, a living institutional secret that everyone knew and nobody named out loud. The third level of fear was the one that kept Donnelly staring at windows. It was the fear of what happened after Harry. Not after Harry retired or transferred or resigned in protest over some final institutional insult, though that scenario was concerning enough on its own terms. The fear was more specific than that. It was the fear of what happened to San Francisco, specifically, if the particular combination of skill and conviction and willingness to absorb personal cost that Harry brought to the gap between law and justice was simply removed from the equation. The city had, over 2 decades, quietly calibrated itself around Harry's existence. Certain crimes didn't escalate to the level they might have because Harry intervened before they escalated. Certain predators didn't operate in certain ways because the accumulated folklore of Harry's responses had made specific categories of behavior operationally inadvisable. Certain cases got closed that would have remained open, certain families received a version of justice they would not otherwise have received, certain mornings happened in certain lives that would have ended without Harry making them possible. None of this was measurable. None of it appeared in any official metric. But it was real, and Donnelly knew it was real, and the people above Donnelly in the chain who were running out of patience and legal cover knew it too, in the same way that you know something when you've been relying on it for long enough that its absence has become unimaginable. The fear of Harry Callahan was, in its deepest form, the fear of a city that had become dependent on something it couldn't officially acknowledge needing, and that had no answer for the question of what it would do when that thing was no longer available. Franklin Cross was convicted, eventually, on arson charges related to 3 of the Sunset District fires. Not the warehouse fire, which never happened, but the 3 prior fires for which the official investigation had eventually assembled adequate evidence through means that would survive appellate scrutiny. He received a sentence that his defense attorney called excessive and that Harry, reading the press account in his apartment one evening, considered roughly appropriate given that the official charges represented perhaps a third of what Cross had actually done. The 40 to 70 people in the warehouse were never identified publicly, had no idea how close they had come to dying, had no reason to connect their continued survival to a detective in a rumpled jacket who had broken a man's wrist in a parking garage 2 blocks from where they slept. Harry didn't follow up on what happened to them. That wasn't part of the job as he understood it. The job ended when the threat ended, and whatever came after was simply the ordinary continuation of lives that had been allowed to continue, which was the entire point, and which required nothing further from him. He set down the newspaper. He turned off the lamp. Outside his window, San Francisco continued being San Francisco. Beautiful and rotten, exhausting and inexhaustible, a city that consumed the people who tried to protect it and kept demanding more from the ones who stayed anyway, and Harry Callahan was still one of the ones who stayed, for reasons that had long since stopped requiring examination, because the reasons were simply who he was, and who he was had been fixed by this city, on these streets, in these cases. Long before any memo or any captain's office conversation or any internal affairs review had tried to talk him into being something else. The November memo was eventually closed without formal disciplinary action, the way every prior memo had been closed, through a combination of outcome documentation, Donnelly's management of the process, and the city attorney's calculation that the cost of pursuing the matter formally outweighed the benefit of the precedent it might set. Harry received a formal written reprimand that was placed in his file, where it joined a collection of similar documents that constituted, in aggregate, one of the most unusual personnel records in the department's history, a catalogue of institutional disapproval attached to a career of institutional indispensability. The paper evidence of a department that had spent 20 years telling Harry he was doing it wrong and relying on him to keep doing it anyway. He signed the acknowledgement of the reprimand with the same flat absence of ceremony he brought to every piece of paperwork the institution required of him, filed his copy in a drawer he rarely opened, and went back to work. The city needed something from him today. It needed something from him every day. The memos would continue. The reviews would continue. The careful, worried conversations in offices with windows would continue. And Harry Callahan would continue walking into situations that the official machinery had already failed, loading his cylinder, and saying whatever needed to be said to whoever needed to hear it, because the alternative had never been an option he was willing to consider, and because San Francisco, for all its beautiful rottenness, was still his city, and its people were still his responsibility, and no 11-page memo had ever changed either of those facts or ever would. The question that none of the memos asked, and that Donnelly had spent the better part of his career carefully avoiding asking out loud, was whether the department's fear of Harry Callahan said more about Harry or about the department itself. Because the fear, examined honestly, was not simply the fear of a man who operated outside the rules. It was the fear of a mirror. Harry Callahan, in his 400 pages of file and his 20 years of after-action reviews and his drawer full of formal reprimands that changed exactly nothing about how he operated, was the most accurate reflection the department had of its own fundamental inadequacy, its inability to produce the outcomes it was created to produce through the means it was authorized to use. Every incident that generated a memo was, simultaneously, a case study in what the official machinery had failed to handle. Every use of force review was, if you read it with both eyes open, also a record of a situation that had escalated to the point where force was required precisely because the official machinery had not intervened earlier and more effectively. Harry didn't create the situations he responded to. He inherited them, from a system that generated them with mechanical regularity and then looked to him, quietly and without official acknowledgement, to resolve them in ways that system had proven itself unable to manage. Blaming Harry for the methods he used in those situations was, in a very specific sense, the department's way of refusing to examine what it was about its own structure and limitations that kept producing situations requiring those methods in the first place. This was not a comfortable insight. It was, however, an accurate one. And Harry had arrived at it, without bitterness and without the need to share it with anyone in his chain of command, approximately 15 years before the November memo landed on Donnelly's desk. What Donnelly understood, sitting in his office after Harry had left, turning the memo over in his hands before putting it back in the drawer, was that the arrangement would continue. Not because anyone had made a deliberate decision to continue it. Not because the department had conducted a clear-eyed analysis of its own dependence and concluded that maintaining Harry's operational latitude was the rational choice. But because the arrangement had been continuing for 20 years on its own momentum, embedded too deeply in how the city functioned to be cleanly extracted, and because the people who might have extracted it had, each time they reached for the lever, found their hands hesitating for the same reason Donnelly's hand had hesitated over the phone that morning. The reason was simple, and nobody said it out loud, and everyone in the building with any real understanding of what Harry Callahan did and how San Francisco worked already knew it. Without Harry, the city would be worse. Not dramatically worse, not in a single visible catastrophic way. But incrementally, consistently, case by case and warehouse by warehouse and liquor store by liquor store and alley by alley, the city would accumulate a weight of unresolved violence and unprevented harm that no amount of procedural correctness would compensate for, because procedural correctness had never been designed to compensate for it, had never been capable of compensating for it. And everyone who had spent more than a decade working in San Francisco law enforcement knew this in there. Bones even when they couldn't or wouldn't say it in a meeting. So the drawer closed. The memo disappeared into the file. Harry went back to work. And San Francisco went on being San Francisco, beautiful and rotten and exhausting and inexhaustible, held together in part by paper and law and the good intentions of institutional men like Donnelly, and in part by something considerably less official, considerably less comfortable to acknowledge, and considerably more essential than any of the official structures would ever be willing to admit out loud. There were younger officers in the department who had never worked directly with Harry but who had absorbed enough of his legend secondhand to have developed strong opinions about him, opinions that split, predictably, along lines that had less to do with Harry himself than with what each officer believed about the nature of police work and its relationship to the law it was supposed to enforce. The idealists, mostly younger, mostly newer to the realities of the city's streets, tended toward strong disapproval. They had come into the job with genuine commitments to the procedural values their training had emphasized, and Harry Callahan represented, to them, exactly the kind of officer whose existence undermined those values. A man whose celebrated outcomes justified, in the department's institutional culture, a tolerance for methods that should have been intolerable, creating a precedent that could be, and in their view eventually would be, claimed by officers with far less of Harry's precision and far more of his willingness to exceed authorized force. This argument was not wrong. It was, in fact, one of the strongest arguments against the arrangement that Donnelly and others maintained around Harry, and it deserved to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as idealism that hadn't yet been weathered by experience. The risk of precedent was real. The risk that Harry's tolerated exceptionalism created cover for less exceptional officers to claim similar latitude was genuine and documented in at least 2 internal affairs cases where defense attorneys had cited Harry's prior incident reviews as evidence that the department's use of force standards were more flexible than the official guidelines suggested. The experienced officers, the ones who had been working San Francisco streets long enough to have their own memories of situations where the procedural machinery had produced catastrophic results, tended toward something more complicated than either approval or disapproval, a kind of weary, conflicted acknowledgement that Harry existed in a real gap that procedural orthodoxy alone couldn't close, combined with a genuine anxiety about the costs of relying on someone to fill that gap indefinitely. These were the officers who showed up at retirement parties and quietly made a point of shaking Harry's hand without saying anything in particular, who would occasionally, in conversations with younger colleagues, offer observations about specific cases that stopped just short of explicit endorsement but communicated, clearly enough to anyone paying attention, that there were things Harry had done that had mattered in ways that no official record would ever fully capture. They weren't celebrating the methods. They were acknowledging the outcomes, with the particular muted honesty of people who had been in the city long enough to understand that outcomes and methods were, in Harry's specific case, inseparable, that you couldn't have one without the other, and that pretending otherwise was a comfortable lie that the department told itself every time it closed another internal affairs file without formal action and sent Harry back to work. Lieutenant Bressler, who had worked alongside Harry for longer than almost anyone still active in the department, had developed over those years a theory about what made Harry genuinely unusual, not his skill, which was extraordinary but not unique, and not his willingness to use force, which was pronounced but not incomparable to other officers in the department's history. What made Harry unusual, in Bressler's assessment, was his complete absence of self-deception about what he was doing and why. Most officers who operated in the gray areas of use of force, and there were more of them than any official document would acknowledge, did so through a process of gradual rationalization, each individual decision defended to themselves through some combination of genuine belief in the justification and a quieter willingness to not examine the justification too carefully. Harry had no such mechanism. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly which rules he was breaking and why. He had made a clear-eyed decision, years ago, that specific outcomes justified specific methods, and he pursued those methods with a transparency to himself, if to nobody else, that was both more honest and more disturbing than the self-deception most people relied on to perform the same function. You couldn't catch Harry in an inconsistency. You couldn't find the moment where his stated justification diverged from his actual reasoning, because his stated justification and his actual reasoning were the same thing. He was not rationalizing. He was simply deciding, and then acting on the decision, and then filing the most technically accurate report possible about what had occurred without including anything that would tell internal affairs what had actually happened. This combination, total internal honesty, total external opacity, was what made him, in Bressler's view, the most difficult officer the department had ever tried to manage. You could catch a self-deceived officer in the gap between what they told themselves and what they actually did. With Harry, there was no gap. There was just the decision, and the act, and the stripped report, and the 11-page memo, and the drawer closing. The city outside Donnelly's window went about its business on the afternoon the memo was filed, indifferent to the institutional drama playing out on the department's upper floor. San Francisco in this era was a city conducting a permanent argument with itself about what kind of place it wanted to be. About how much disorder was the acceptable cost of freedom, about whether safety and civil liberties were genuinely in tension or whether the apparent tension was a manufactured excuse for the kind of heavy-handed policing that had its own long history of producing harm. Harry Callahan existed at the sharpest point of that argument, embodying, in his single person, everything that each side of it found most troubling about the other. The civil libertarians saw in him the face of unchecked power, a detective who had appointed himself judge and executioner, whose celebrated results created a template for exactly the kind of policing that the legal safeguards they valued were designed to prevent. The people who lived in the neighborhoods Harry patrolled, who knew the names of the threats Harry had neutralized and the cases Harry had closed, saw something different. Saw a man who showed up when the official response didn't, who treated the safety of ordinary people as a non-negotiable rather than a variable to be balanced against procedural purity, who operated according to a set of priorities that placed the actual human beings in danger above the institutional mechanisms designed to protect them. Both views contained truth. Neither contained all of it. And Harry Callahan, as he always did, moved through the argument about him with the same flat indifference he brought to every institutional obstacle, not unaware of it, not dismissive of it, but simply unwilling to let it slow him down or change what he did, because the argument would continue regardless, and the city needed something from him today, as it had needed something from him every day for 20 years, and the argument could wait while the work got done. The drawer in Donnelly's desk that held the November memo also held, by the time of this particular filing, memos from 4 prior years in 5 prior incidents, each one representing a case that had been reviewed, processed, and closed without formal action in the same sequence this one would eventually follow. Donnelly had looked at all of them together only once, spreading them across his desk one evening after everyone else in the building had gone home, reading through them in chronological order as a single continuous document rather than as the series of isolated incidents each was officially treated as. What they read as, in that context, was not a record of a problematic officer who needed to be managed. It was a record of a city that kept producing situations that fell outside the boundaries of official response and that had found, in Harry Callahan, a single human solution to a structural problem it had no institutional will to actually solve. The memos were not, in the end, about Harry. They were about San Francisco. About what San Francisco was, and what it demanded, and what it was willing to officially acknowledge versus what it was willing to rely on in practice. Harry was simply the most visible symptom of the gap between those two things, the gap that Donnelly had spent 26 years carefully not examining directly, because examining it directly led to conclusions that nobody in his position could afford to act on and nobody in the city's political apparatus had any interest in confronting. He gathered the memos back into their individual folders. He put them back in the drawer. He turned off the light. And on Monday morning Harry Callahan would be back at work, and the city would need something from him, and the arrangement would continue, as it always had, and as everyone who understood it knew it would continue until something changed that was more fundamental than any memo could capture or any drawer could contain.